welcome to those of you here at PSU and those who are listening via cable. We're thrilled to have both audiences. I'm Sandy Polishuk, and I'm with History of Social Justice Organizing. And tonight is our second panel on the history of the Portland women's movement. Last, in January, we dealt with the witches, the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. That was back in the 70s. I don't think anyone would put terrorist in their name today, but that shows you how times have changed. Is that not working? Do you want me to start over? We also had a presenter talking about organizing that went back in the 70s of women of color, including a black lesbian group that were the first to bring Sweet Honey in the Rock to Portland. And we talked about organizing at PSU, including a baby in the president's office that ultimately led to daycare on campus for students. And tonight, we have, we're supposed to have 4 speakers, but at least we have 3, and they are some fabulous people who, all of them were involved in not just activism, as we talked about last time, but activism that actually created institutions. Some of them still existing, and some of them existing for a time, and no longer. I think there's room for some more chairs up in the front too, and also in the back. So we have our first speaker. I think I'll introduce all the speakers, and then they'll each talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for a discussion between them and with you who are here at PSU with us. And I want to just mention one more thing, which is that the Center for Women in Politics and Policy here at PSU is helping us tonight by co-sponsoring and providing this space. Our first speaker is going to be Kristen Knapp, who is with the Red Emma Collective, which was named after Emma Goldman. She started there in 1972. She, along with others, founded Prescott House. That was a place for women getting out of prison to readjust to society. And by 1975, it had, with the development of the consciousness of institutional violence against women, it evolved into Bradley Angle House, which still exists today, the first shelter for women escaping violence on the West Coast. And our next speaker will be Ruth Gundle. Ruth was one of the founders of the Community Law Project in 1975, and we have another of the founders in the audience tonight. This was a feminist law collective, and it represented both women and organizations, like, for example, the Trojan Decommissioning Alliance, which we've actually done a program on. The Portland Tenants Union. She won the first lesbian custody case in Oregon. She brought the first sexual harassment case in Oregon. Much, much work that was very, very important. And she has moved on to become an editor and a publisher, and the co-founder of a women's writing retreat and workshops that went on for a number of years. So she's been a very important activist in our community. Mae Wallace, who some of you who have been around a long time may remember as Susan Crawford, was a member of the Main Street Gathering, which was a collective of activists working to create a just society. And she was helped launch the Rape Relief Hotline in 1973, and that evolved into the Portland Women's Crisis Line, which still exists. She is now an artist and remains an activist, and is a retired art teacher. So I'm going to hand it over to Kristen.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. Did we get a word of Anne if she's coming? She's not able to come. Okay, okay. well, we're sorry, but we have other people from Red Emma who will be able to contribute at that point in the program. So I'm Kristen Knapp. I came to Portland after graduating from college. I did graduate from high school here, but I went away to school, and then I came back right after college. And that was the point at which I began to be aware of the women's movement. Not that I hadn't noticed it at my college, but I hadn't been involved with it in any way, shape, or form. And so it was just really after college, I had the opportunity. I'd already been to Latin America. I went to on a Venceremos brigade to Cuba right after I graduated from college. I was a sociology major. I was very interested in the whole concept of social change in Latin America, and so I went to Cuba when I had that opportunity, and then I came back to Portland right after that. And that's when I started first, I don't like the boominess of this mic. It's got a little low feedback. That's when I first noticed that there were lesbians in the community and that I figured out that I was one of them. So I wanted to kind of set the stage for you of what was going on then. 1970 was the year that I graduated from college. And we had had a lot of political chaos up in the decade preceding that. You know, JFK was assassinated, MLK was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The '68 Democratic Convention in Chicago was a complete, you know, demonstrations and violence and riots in the streets. And there were many institutions were struggling to maintain control within the society, and many people were thinking this was the revolution, you know, everything was happening. The war was still happening in Vietnam. It was chaos, really, in lots of places. I called it political chaos, but also social chaos. Free speech movement, sexual liberation movement, free mind experimentation, LSD, all kinds of drugs on the heels of the civil rights movement, Stonewall, the women's movement. Everything was being called into question. The status quo was not being maintained. And young people, especially those of us in my generation, really felt like things were going to change and we were going to be part of making that change. So I just think that obviously most people here today lived through this time, so it's not so much like we have to tell everybody what it was like there, because most of us lived through it. But I think for people today, it is hard to really realize how much energy there was in the world for making change, and that we just had a sense of things were happening. You know that song, Mrs. Jones, things are happening. Something's happening, you don't know what it is, do you, Mrs. Jones? And you know, that was the ambiance in which we were. So within that, we were figuring out how to stand up for ourselves and how to recognize our own oppression. All of these movements had made us aware of oppression of various groups of people, and I know for myself, you know, growing up in high school and in junior high, I was very aware of the civil rights movement and felt very supportive of that and wanted to be involved in that. But as things moved on and the identity politics kind of kicked in and the Black Panthers started to come to the foreground, you know, it was sort of like, okay, it's our movement, you guys back off, you know, leave us alone, we're going to make our own decisions about things. And that was the moment at which I think, as a woman, I realized that I needed to look at myself and what was a genuine thing for me to be involved in, not being out in the world trying to help someone else that I perceived as oppressed, but looking at myself to figure out what my oppression was and where I could function as a political person from a genuine place of my own empowerment. So that was kind of, that, I don't know, to me that was one of the conditions that came around. At first there was all this chaos, there was the identity politics, and then there was this sort of sense of we were each trying to figure out what our own role could be based on who we were and you know, I knew I couldn't be a leader in the civil rights movement. It wasn't my movement, but what could I be a leader in? Well, I could be a leader on something to do with lesbians or something to do with women. And so I started searching for that and trying to figure that out. Once we discovered and could name our own oppression, I mean, part of the whole thing that I remember from that time was figuring out what it was that we were oppressed about, you know. Well, how were we oppressed? You know, we knew that we were making the coffee at all the political meetings, and we were, you know, picking up the child care and doing all the cooking and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, what was it that how could we really name our own oppression? And I know that a lot of what happened at that time was poems that were published and prose and stories that we told each other, consciousness raising. We really focused on trying to share with each other the things that we were thinking inside our own head, and discovered that other women were thinking the same things, or that we had similar stories, and we developed a common bond because of that. So there was a strong movement for separatism from men entirely here in Portland. There was a really strong segment of the community that was very concerned about creating women-only space and really did not want men in that space at all. And we had a lot of wars and fights around that at the women's bookstore, and lots of mass meetings where we would get together and argue about, should men be allowed to come in because they need to be educated, or should they not be allowed to come in because they need to learn to respect women's space? You know, so that went on for several years also. But all of this thinking and all of this discussion fueled many institutions. And that's what we're kind of here to talk about today, is how we took that energy and what we did with it here in Portland. And I think Portland really is a very special place, and was at that time. And my perspective on that is based on having traveled a lot as a musician in the 70s and in the 80s and even into the 90s, and seeing the different communities around the country where we performed, and realizing that Portland really had a very well-developed women's community with many institutions in many kinds of fields and arenas. And it was, I think Oregon is just a really special place. So among the institutions we created were, they were all institutions that we needed, that we wanted for ourselves, things we needed. In my case, I felt like, how could I be 22 years old and not know how to take care of my car if I was going to be an independent woman? I had grown up in a family with 3 boys, 3 brothers, and I was the oldest, and all I knew how to do was hold the flashlight. And they all knew how to tune up a car and rebuild an engine and do, you know, all these things. And so I thought that was very curious, and I had never even thought about that till I got out of college and came home and started to look at this kind of stuff. So my partner at the time and I, Naomi Little Bear, who I played music with, we taught classes in auto mechanics in our living room, and we had classes for women, and we went out into the parking lot downtown and taught women how to change the oil in their car on a weekend, Saturday afternoon. And it was very empowering, not only for them, but for us too, to be able to be part of teaching others and helping others to gain this knowledge. It wasn't that everybody was going to become a mechanic, which I did, but it was that we hoped that everybody would feel more comfortable talking to the garages and the people who would fix their cars in the future. So we also wanted to become independent in terms of money, and I remember that we established a women's credit union. That was a really big thing, because Mary was involved in that too. There may be other people in the room who were involved in that. And it was, you know, it was harder for women to get credit then, unless you had your husband co-signing for you, you know. It was really very difficult. So that was important. We had karate classes. A lot of us took karate. Karate for Women was a big, a local place that we all studied. And I think I was as a brown belt, but that was a long time ago. Some of us went on. Janisa is still doing karate. She was sort of the next generation. Women's Clinic was the other one that was a big thing. In Red Emma Collective, we were involved in starting the Women's Clinic. And I think Molly could talk about that, and I think maybe Kathleen could even talk about that. At some point, we'll delve into that a little bit more. But our collective opened a storefront pregnancy testing center on Hawthorne, and that was the start of the Women's Clinic. And that would have been, what year did you start?
1971.
71, yep, okay.
It opened in May, June.
Oh.
June.
Oh, you remember exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's fabulous. And I know that we did self-pelvic exams or exams for each other, you know, that whole era in which we were learning how to demystify our own bodies and figure out what they look like and how they functioned, and it was a very empowering time. So there was that, there was women's music, which I was very involved with, and then there was domestic violence, and I am sort of tasked with talking about that, so I want to give you a little background on Bradley Angle House. I do have a copy of the book, The Women of Bradley Angle, which was published very early on. It's written on a typewriter, and it's stories of the women who were there in the early days. And you're welcome to come and look at that afterwards. But Bonnie, Tinker, and I from Red Emma House decided we were going to open Prescott House, or we were going to open some kind of house, or we just needed a project. We wanted a project. The clinic was already kind of going, and we were looking for something else. And we decided to do this house for women coming out of prison because we determined that society was not friendly to women who had been in prison, and we were getting to know many lesbians who were in the bars, and we hadn't been in the bars ourselves much before, and so it was kind of new and interesting to us. And we met a woman who was coming out of prison, and so we decided we'd make this house to help her and others like her. Well, it turned out, I think she was the only woman who was coming out of prison who ever came there. But a lot of the women who were in the bars at that time were homeless, were working in the sex industry, were drug addicted, were having very difficult time surviving, and their lives were very violent in many different ways. So this house became a kind of a safe haven and a place where they could come and live. And eventually, out of that, a year and a half, 2 years later, those women who came to live at Prescott House figured out that what we needed was a domestic violence shelter. And the term domestic violence didn't even exist at that time, but what they needed was a safe place for women to escape from violence. So that's how Bradley Angle got founded, was by the women who had come to live at Prescott House. They figured it out for themselves, and they founded the organization.
Time I could say something about
Say it on the mic if you're going to talk, because we're broadcasting.
Yeah. One of my memories is that in between Prescott House and what became Bradley Angle House, there was a transitional house, and one of the women from the sex industry in Prescott House, Dorothy Jackson, her nickname was Monkey, was a heroin addict, and one of the women in the general community, one of us more or less middle class coming out of college, doing all these revolutionary things, devoted her life to more or less stalking her to help her get off of heroin. And so this woman, she wasn't the only one, there were others, as Kristen had said, but I remember that she organized a potluck to start this house for women first to get off of alcohol and drugs, and again, it's all, violence is all part of it, and that morphed into VA House. I just really wanted to make a tribute to this woman, Dorothy Jackson, because I remember that the roots were so much from the streets.
That's Kathleen Clark, who was also part of Red Emma.
Well, I guess I'm next. I'm Ruth Gundle, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Community Law Project. I'm really glad that Mary Forrest is here. She was a major figure in that little institution as well, and I hope she'll add to what I say in the discussion period. My comments are really very specific about that experience, which for me was about 3 years. I had been a feminist at the end of my college years, at the end of the 60s. I'd gone to law school thinking, I was also a big lefty activist. I'd gone to law school thinking I was going to be a criminal lawyer defending people in protests and in people, you know, who'd gone underground and that sort of thing. I came out thinking I would be a feminist lawyer, although feminism was very new then, and feminist law was very new, and it was very unclear exactly what the possibilities there were. I will mention that I took a class in my law school with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as it turns out, on women in the law, and she was just on the radio. Recently, there's an article coming out in the New Yorker about her. She was an amazing woman. So I had just taken the bar exam in the summer of 1975 when 3 of us, who had only just met, I think through the National Lawyers Guild, which is a very left political organization. It sounds very mainstream, I just want you to know it wasn't. We got the idea to start a feminist law collective. Kathleen Herron had just also taken the bar. Ruth Gundle had been working as a secretary for a law firm. We wanted to be feminist activists as lawyers and to do it in a feminist way, not what we considered to be the lefty macho way of the time. Although we were definitely connected up to both those worlds, the left and the women's community that Kristen has described so well, it's the hubbub of alternative institutions. It was a world that you could almost live in completely, and many women did, and probably many women who are here did. We lived in it, but we worked in a third world, one that we called the, quote, real world of courts and law firms. And we referred to it as downtown. So there was what to us was the real world. And then, unlike most of the other alternative institutions, we really had to straddle those 2 worlds. Kathleen and I had practically no experience doing real legal work. We were just out of law school, as I said. We knew how to approach a legal problem in terms of the law, but we had no idea how to take on a case, pleadings, deal with judges, when to stand up and sit down in a courtroom. Rose, who had been the secretary, was the ballast, as she knew all of that, and we could never have done it without her. There were many others who joined the 3 of us over time, and I'm not going to mention them all, but I do want to mention Carol Rahm, Becky Shine, Mary Forrest, who's here, Catherine English, and Cindy Comfer. I know that many of you will know them. We started out at the old Centenary Wilbur Church at 9th and Pine, the once huge Methodist church, which was now down to about 15 congregants, and had made its rooms available for free to all kinds of alternative projects. I know the Bridge was there, the alternative newspaper, and about a few dozen other political organizations. It had been a beautiful building and was now pretty dilapidated. It was never cleaned. It was unbelievably grotty, but it buzzed with energy. Austin Harper Richardson was the pastor, and he had an assistant whose name I've lost, whose wife was then busy starting Sisters of the Road Cafe. They met with us and told us they were full up. They were really sorry. Every room was taken. But just as we were leaving, they kind of came after us and said that, well, why not just join them in their office? They were down to sharing a rather grand, dark room with ornate oak trim, as I remember it. We were a bit surprised at this offer, but as we had no other prospects for a free office, we said yes, and I think we moved in the next day. For some period of time, we not only shared the office, but we shared their desks and their phone. They weren't there much, but when they were, we passed the phone back and forth. I think we'd been there a few hours when a young woman called needing help the next morning. Her dog, Dallas, had been accused of killing sheep in Troutdale and was facing the death penalty. It became a rather hilarious story, which I don't have time to tell you now, except to say that I got the dog off. We charged her $25, and her father stuffed a lot of bills in my pocket as we leapt down the courthouse hallway, wild with victory. We were pretty excited about the cash, too. It was the first entry in our accounts book. Although you could live in Southeast Portland then on very little, and maybe that's something we can all talk about, lots of you here I recognize is from that time. None of us had any other source of income, so we had to pay ourselves something, which meant that we had to do some work that paid. During that first year, there were many weeks with no paycheck, and sometimes it was about $50. Eventually, we moved into a small house near 20th and Belmont where we had a few rooms for offices. It had an unfinished attic that we let Kay Soul and Jean DeMaster use, and that's where TACS began. Many of you know Technical Assistance for Community Services. We bought turn-of-the-century oak desks and old rugs and filing cabinets at estate and garage sales. And we all had lunch together in the kitchen and discussed problems with cases, successes, and sometimes naughty problems amongst ourselves. I had a beloved dog, Rachel, famous for being wild, who I often brought to work. A favorite story of all of ours from that time, Mary will remember this, was when a lawyer from a downtown law office came for depositions, and Rachel knocked him down as he stepped into the house. He picked himself up quickly, and also because we all kind of ran to help him, saw that we were all women, and stammered, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm in the wrong place," and walked out. And someone had to chase him down the block and bring him back, where he glared at Rachel all through the deposition. It may be hard for those who didn't live through that time to imagine such a thing as a law firm of only women being unimaginable. During those years, the official dress code for state courts was a suit and tie. It was years before it was changed to something that contemplated women lawyers. Once during those years, I had a case that took me out to Yamhill County, and the judge stared and stared at me and seemed surprised every time I opened my mouth. At the end of the day, he told me he had never had a woman lawyer in his courtroom before. We were certainly not the only women practicing law in Portland then, but there weren't many. We were still just a handful. An ancient practice known as call was in use then. If you had a case waiting to be assigned to a judge, you had to appear before the presiding judge at 9 every morning and wait for 45 minutes to hear if your case was assigned, and then write down the details hurriedly. They didn't believe in scheduling the modern way or using the mail. You were not allowed to read anything during that time. You had to sit and pretend you hung on every word he said. And so there was really nothing to do but look around the room. It was rare to see another woman. We represented, as Sandy said, the Portland Tenants Union, protesters of all kinds, including one of our very big cases, the Trojan Decommissioning Alliance criminal trial, that Kathleen and I were 2 of the 7 lawyers on the defense team that won the big case in Columbia County. I think it was in 76 or 77. And as she said, we represented the first openly lesbian custody case, which we won. And we took on the first sexual harassment case in Oregon. I want to talk a little bit about that, although the term had not yet been coined, because sexual harassment had not yet been included in the Civil Rights Act under which sex discriminations were normally brought. We brought our case under an Oregon tort law called outrageous conduct, which was used for situations like burying someone in the wrong grave. It was defined more or less officially as a cause of action in which the average person, upon hearing the facts, would say, "That's outrageous." We lost that case on a motion for summary judgment. The judge very apologetically said that the average person, upon hearing how our client had been sexually harassed by her boss for over a number of years, would not think it was particularly outrageous. It was, on the contrary, very ordinary behavior. I think that it's the only cutting edge, maybe Mary can remember differently, it's the only cutting edge pro bono case that we took and lost. And we took it very hard. But I'd like to think that just in doing it, we did some little something to move things forward. It was a very, very new idea then. We ourselves didn't really know what to call it and did not use the term sexual harassment. Our paid work was primarily domestic relations, divorces, custody battles, the lowest status legal work of all, which we did not just for the practical reason of needing to charge fees for something, but also because it was women's work. It was at the heart of women's lives, and anything about women that was despised, we claimed as a badge of honor. That was a tenet of our feminism. It probably sounds familiar to all of you. It was grueling work emotionally and sometimes scary. A woman lawyer was murdered by her client's husband in the middle of a custody trial one day when I was in the courthouse. And for years afterward, you could still see a faint stain of blood on the carpet in Mercedes Diaz's courtroom. Occasionally we got a paying case that was not domestic relations. I represented a very old guy against the Lloyd Development Company, a huge outfit with a law firm from Chicago representing them. They were building what later became the Holiday Park Plaza retirement community near Lloyd Center, and were encroaching on this man's, oh no, don't tell me, I ran out of paper in my printer. Oh well, I'll just talk. I did kind of write this out, as you can tell. They were encroaching on his property, and they had already bulldozed his prized camellias when he came to us, and I think he must have been all over town and nobody would take the case. And of course, naturally, it was coming up right away. I had done a lot of domestic relations trial work, but I had never done a really big civil formal trial, and this was before a judge who was considered to be the absolute scariest judge in the state. He had a real temper, and he barked all the time, and people sort of fairly shook when I told him that I'd been assigned to him. So it was a week-long trial that hinged on very obscure law of adverse possession, and here I was completely not knowing what I was doing before this scary judge who somehow took pity on me and would kind of, you know, help me along. I would kind of sit there spaced out and he'd say, "Now, Ruth, now's the time to..." And it was before a judge, not a jury, and I did win the case, which one of the many amazing things when I look back on this, I just can't even imagine really hardly any of it, that we were as wildly crazy as we were to try to do what we did, but that we were as successful as we were. I wanted to talk a little bit about what in some ways were the biggest challenges. Of course, it was challenging that we were terribly inexperienced. We felt like minnows in a sea of sharks most of the time. We had no money. We flew by the seat of our pants. But in some ways, the biggest challenge was working together. And that was because we really, you know, we could have all gotten jobs as lawyers with firms, but we wanted to work in a feminist way. And we didn't know very much about what that meant. We knew a little bit. We kind of made it up as we went along. And it was really hard. And we had big ideas, and we were, all of us, quite young and with very, very undeveloped notions of group dynamics. And our ideas were way bigger than our abilities were to really live up to them. So we made all of our decisions by consensus. And I was going to explain that, but I see everybody nodding, you know what I'm talking about. And not just a vague idea, but a very specific program of how that worked. And I mean every decision. So, you know, not just who to hire, but we had issues about age and balance between lesbians and straight women, and whether they should be a lawyer or not a lawyer. But, you know, whether to buy a new Selectric typewriter and what to have for lunch, and, you know, so an enormous part of the day was made up with these meetings which meant that we had to work into the night and the weekends to get our work done. And it was exhausting, it was exhilarating, it was demoralizing, it was a lot of things. And I've just been told that I have to wrap it up. So I guess I'll stop there and we can talk more about that and things like it in the open session.
Okay. Can you hear me back there? Yes. Good. Okay. So my name's Mae Wallace. As Sandy said, I used to be Susan Crawford, and that's a long story. I won't go into it as to how that happened. But anyway, so I'm Mae Wallace. So it's really funny to get old enough to be considered a historic figure. But here we are. And I see a lot of people in the audience are my age, so you probably understand. So we started the hotline, the Rape Relief Hotline, because many of us, there was a group of us, and actually one of the other founders is here, Nora Rankin's in the back there. And also Rebecca's here, the present executive director, Rebecca Nichols. So you guys can just chirp right on up if my memory fails me. So anyway, back in, it was about 70, I was walking home from Lewis and Clark College where my boyfriend, I wasn't a student there then, I had been, but I was walking home very late at night and somebody jumped out of the bushes and raped me. And my experience with the police and with all the people that get involved in those things was pretty bad. I was taken downtown, I was interviewed by 6 people in their break room, 6 policemen in their break room. I was examined by a doctor who never said one word to me the whole time. And it was in the jail, it was a male, it was just him. I mean, the whole thing was a pretty bad experience. The next couple of days I went in, I was called in to look at pictures, and the vice policeman, the detective who interviewed me was trying to set me at ease by telling rape jokes. So it was a different world. I mean, I'm sure those things happened, but it was a different world back then, and a couple of years later I was sitting around one of the things that happened is as I got to know people and talked about my experience, I found out that a lot of other women had had similar experiences and some, appalling situations they'd gotten into. So we decided that we would do something about it. We'd heard that in Seattle there was an organization called the Rape Relief Hotline, and we decided to go up and find out what they were doing. We didn't know what the heck we were getting into. I think one of the wonderful things about that time is there was a sense when we got together that we could do stuff, and we had no idea that we couldn't. So we did, I was 21 when we started talking about the hotline, and I didn't know anything. I didn't know how to run a meeting, how to do anything, but we learned very quickly. We learned what not to do by doing the things and saying, well, that was a bad idea, or we'll go on and do something else. So anyway, it took about 2 years for us to get the hotline together, to organize it, get training, get people going, and our first office we incorporated in 73. We opened in, it was like, I can't remember whether it was spring or it was late summer. It must have been late summer. We opened in what used to be a bathroom in the Women's Health Clinic. Yeah, it used to be a bathroom. We had a bathtub which we put a piece of plywood over and we used it as a desk. It was a tiny room. And we had CETA money. Does anyone remember? Yes. How many people would just be thrilled to vote for Richard Nixon now compared to Obama? Anyway, we had CETA money and we split it. I think we had 3 grants and we split it so that there were 6 of us who were employed, and we kept it for a whole year, and it really got the hotline off the ground. You know, having some money in our pocket, which wasn't a lot of money, but having some money. I think that one of our meetings, Bonnie Tinker was there, and she was trying to get together rent for one of the houses. I don't know whether it was Bradley Angle House. I think maybe it was that transitional one. I'm not sure. She had money for rent, and my husband and I were doing war resistor stuff. So I was taking 10% of my income, so we paid the rent. Anyway, but we lived on nothing, like we said. We made all of our decisions by consensus, same thing. It was appallingly difficult, and it was a long time. And our baby's all grown up. And they have money and they pay people. It's wonderful. You wanted people to talk about some of the things that were happening around the time. And I'm thinking that that is an interesting thing, because I think that one of the reasons that Nora and I and some of the others were able to do what we did was because we lived in a collective house, and we shared our income, and we had the support of people. And I'm not sure that if I'd been living on my own that I would have done, somebody else would have done it because it needed to be done. But I think that fact that we lived in this communal house, and different people, there were several things that came out of that communal house. There was sunshine recycling that now is Cloudburst, isn't it, Nora? And there was, I think there was at least one food co-op that came out of that. There was something else I'm forgetting. But anyway, there were a number of different functional sort of institutions that came as a part of that collective. And do I have time to say one more thing? So one of the things that happened to me, and I think, Nora, I hate to speak for you, but was that we lived in this house. It was the Main Street Gathering, which was part of the Movement for a New Society. It was a pacifist organization. And I came into this struggle as an anti-war activist. I tried, you know, sort of Quaker type thing. I'd actually gone to Quaker meetings for a while. It was kind of a religious direction that it came from. And the experience of starting the hotline and starting to deal with the police and starting to deal with victims, we had to fight on both sides. We had the pacifists who were saying, well, women should never fight back. I'm not going to tell any woman not to fight back. And realizing that I didn't want to fight. I mean, I wanted to fight back. If I was attacked, I would fight back. And the other thing was the more left-leaning people saying that we shouldn't work with the police. And I think that we arrived together at a more sane approach to politics, and where we realized that pacifism was a wonderful ideal and a great tactic, but maybe not the end, and that we couldn't be ultra-left about this. You know, we couldn't say, well, we'll never cooperate. We're gonna, we're gonna tell these women not to talk to the police. I mean, good grief. And then the other thing is that we also started to realize that there was domestic violence and incest. We're getting calls for those things. And we hadn't anticipated that. So we had an education about what sort of violent things that women were dealing with at the time. So that's basically it.
Thank you so much. Is this one no good? Oh, it doesn't go on the air. Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So we're going to open it up for discussion between them and with you. I just wanted to say before we move on to that, there is one chair up here. And somebody can come sit in my chair if any of you out there would like to come in. We are hoping to do in late May another program on the Portland women's movement. One topic we're going to talk about is the founding of the original Women's Studies at Portland State, which was long before it was a department, long before it had degrees. And I'm not quite sure what else. We're having a little bit of problem getting this one together. But those of you who are here, you can get informed by signing our email list. There's one on the table out there, and I'll pass around this clipboard for signatures as well. You can also find out what we're doing. We have a blog if you Google History of Social Justice Organizing, and we also have a Facebook page, so those are all ways to find out about that next program. And I think because we are on cable and we need to have everything mic'd, I think I'm going to take that fourth mic and bring it around to people who want to speak. But first, do you guys have things you want to talk about?
Share.
Yeah. Well, no, there's an extra one down there. Yeah. But do you guys want to talk among yourselves at all before we open it up to the audience?
Well, I'm wondering if we shouldn't say a little more about the women's clinic, and maybe some of the other Red Emma women who are here could do that, because Ann Muzzy, who isn't here,
right?
was going to speak about that. And
introduce yourselves.
Okay, I'm Kathleen Clark, and I was a resident of Red Emma. Molly Clark, my sister, and and Donna Schaefer was close to everybody. Anyway, there was 8 of us in Red Emma. I just wanted to say a little more about Red Emma, and that it was, and May was talking about the experience of sharing money. We flopped on whatever mattress we flopped on for the night. We shared all our, we shared all our money and clothes, more or less. Of course, we couldn't all fit into the same sizes. When I got here for example, in Portland, I was just beginning to learn about health food, and dear Kristen was making yogurt and sprouts, and we were able to live cheaply, and we made many decisions. I don't think we made as many consensus decisions. When I arrived was when they were painting the women's health clinic, and one of the things about the women's health clinic was on Hawthorne, 35th, about 35th or so, and we wanted it to be in a working class neighborhood. Hawthorne, of course, was really different back then than it is now. And so that was important to us. And we also wanted to learn as much as we could. And we got some training from outside in. And there were some secret meetings to try to overtake outside in. It became very sort of convoluted and at times paranoid. But we, in the women's health clinic, and then also going to the bars, as Kristen talked, one of the magic things of this period is that there was this class crossover. Not just class, but like we would relating to people in the bars, and some of those people ended up at the women's health clinic, and the different working class people, there was a special way that we got really close to people that doesn't often happen. People that were very, a lot of us had dropped out of college and were from middle class homes. There were these different households. There was Michigan House, people from the University of Michigan, and various houses like that. Most of the Portland Revolutionary Youth Movement, Reed, and in our house in Red Emma is for Red Emma Goldman, and it was a pink house just south of Portland. Just south of Hawthorne, and it was Grinnell College. I didn't go to Grinnell College, but Bev Schnabel, yay, Bev Schnabel. I'm sorry, Bev Schnabel, Bonnie Tinker, Ann Muzzy, Molly, all went, and Barbara Devereaux.
There were 5 from Grinnell.
5 from Grinnell.
Who actually moved out here as a collective.
Yeah.
All dropouts, all before they graduated.
And then Sky Haverman was from Reed, and Kristen from Oberlin, and me from Lake Forest. Anyway, so.
Right.
Yeah.
And, well, Donna was also there? I don't remember. Was Donna an official member of Red
No, I was not
Emma?
an official member.
You were an unofficial guest most of the time. Yes.
I was wondering if maybe we should go, just informally, let people shout out here what you were involved in during that time.
on the air, so I'm going to pass the mic around.
Okay, or maybe someone could repeat it. Because I just have a sense.
Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, those days were so different in terms of, we just decided we're going to start a health clinic. It's kind of like Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. We're going to put on a show. So we got this storefront. We didn't have to do licensing, insurance, anything like you would do now. And we called up doctors and asked them if they would do free referrals for anyone that we had at the clinic. And, you know, at that time, as at this time, many people didn't have health insurance. And an amazing amount of doctors said, yeah, I'll take a referral. And so that was one of the services that we offered. There were increasing conflicts within the clinic. People haven't been talking a lot about that. Well, consensus, and one of the conflicts was the clinic for all of us, or was it us helping them? And so there was, you know, there were single women there with children who were part of the women's clinic group, and they said, you know, we're all the people, you know, it isn't us and them. So that was one of the conflicts, and I don't know exactly how the women's clinic morphed into the clinic it became. The abortion clinic, the women's health clinic, I think for years was on division and did abortions. So it morphed from the storefront on Hawthorne to the later clinic it became, and I don't know a lot about that transition. Maybe other people here do, but anyway.
So if you want to raise your hands, I'll bring the mic around. People want to talk?
Or maybe people just want to say what they were involved in, what they were connected with, what kinds of things.
Whatever, or ask questions of the panel.
I thought it'd be interesting just to say that there were all these different projects which I remember very well, and it's important to remember that we all knew about each other, even though we might not ever have anything to do with it, some of those other projects. One of the ways that we knew that was there was a women's newspaper, and the very first paid job I ever got as a writer, I got a CETA grant, and I wrote articles after the women's newspaper became Rag Times, and there were little ads for all these different, for the clinic and for the law project and all of the different things you've been talking about, and it was one way in which the community, the larger community, became cohesive, even though everybody was really busy in their own little corner, working on their own little project.
And we all saw each other at Mount Moving Cafe Women's Night.
Or we talked
and
on
at the women's
KBOO.
Concerts.
And KBOO was there.
And KBOO is here.
And KBOO was here.
And Caitlin is still here, which is great.
And please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Teresa. What you all are talking about is amazing, and it sounds so much like what's going on with Occupy and everything I hear with the young people these days. I was just wondering if anybody else had those parallels, or if we have any younger people here who can say, yes, it's happening again.
Somebody just asked me, what did CETA stand for? Wasn't it Comprehensive Employment Training Act? Yes.
You want to say a little bit more about that, because
It's government money that was given out very freely for all kinds of things. Mary actually got a CETA grant for the law project, and we put together a women's rights handbook. I mean, you had to have some kind of a project, and it was very short-term money. But to us, it was just, you know, manna from heaven, because we had no money otherwise, and here came this money to do something that we wanted to do.
And it was $833 a month, and we split that 2 or 3 ways.
Yes,
and we lived on it.
We paid like 3 or 4 people on that. Somebody stood up in the back and went, yes.
Oops. You're going to have to come around here.
Michelle Alexander. I just wanted to briefly say that the CETA money came out of a slowed economy.
And it's interesting to me that it was mentioned earlier that some of the things that were done then by Republican administrations, we can't seem to manage to get going now under the Democrats. So it's time for some change again.
I think one of the things, I mean, things, you know, it was a long time ago and there were lots of things that were very different, but something that we've all mentioned is that you could live on practically nothing in Portland at that time. And that was so crucial to making all these things possible. You could rent a beautiful old house in Southeast, say like on 15th and Alder, I remember, where my sister lived. $125, and 6 people lived there very comfortably, you know. So the fact that Portland became the kind of city it is now, it was a very sleepy, you know, little city back then. We hardly had any skyscrapers. I think we had one building that was taller than 4 stories. And now it's not possible to do that, which makes it a lot harder to think about doing these wild and crazy things that we did. But I think also we had each other, and we had that sense that we were all in it together. And it's very hard to convey what that energy was like. I think all of us have kind of tried. But we really felt like we were part of something very big, very important, hugely bigger than we were, that was going to change the world. And did in many ways, yeah, it did in many ways.
I think that is the parallel with Occupy, because I think there is that feeling there that...
I just want to point out that during that time, minimum wage was $1.65. So I don't know if it was cheaper then. I don't really, I mean, someone needs to do the math.
I can add to that. I'm Elsie Hansen. I was a letter carrier. Basically the first of this generation women letter carriers at that time. Started in the post office in 1973, and I bought a house based on having that fabulous straight job, one in 1976. And that communal house was the one that got that sunshine recycling or cloudburst or whatever it was called to actually cross to the south of Powell. That was pretty radical. And pretty soon a whole bunch of dykes started to live around in that corner, which is Brooklyn. And there was a palpable sense of community. I was sleeping with my girlfriend out in the backyard on a hot summer night when some dude crawled over the fence and decided to have his way with the girlfriend while I was inside, naked in the bathtub. And, you know, I heard the strangulated call and got out there to find my girlfriend strangling this guy, you know, who had his pants down around his ankles. And, you know, we both grabbed him, completely oblivious of what you're not supposed to do, right? Completely oblivious. We haul him in by he was pretty drunk. We haul him in to the house and call the neighbors. We didn't call the police, we called the neighbors. The neighbors, you know, Judy McGuinn came over there with a stick, and we were talking about whether we should take him down to the local park and tie him to a tree and do other bad things to him. And, you know, at this point he's saying, police. So when the police came, the woman police officer said, "Good job." So there were issues like that where you would just call your friends and your friends could be relied upon, and then after your friends got together and did some activist job with you, your friends also would then fight with you over class consciousness or male identification or, you know, who had which item. I remember when I bought my house with my best friend, we were identified as being middle-class bourgeoisie because we were property owners. But I do think it was actually cheaper then. I bought that house for $19,000, and you just can't do that anymore. You could live more cheaply. You can live very cheaply now if you're willing to forego normal American values. But in those days, those normal American values hadn't become so addictive. There really weren't as many things that you wanted to spend money on. And so we spent the little amount of money we had supporting ourselves and our friends.
Nora Rankin, co-founder with me and some others of the Women's Crisis Line, then the Rape Hotline. I just wanted to take it in a slightly different direction over time, too. We've talked about all the different groups. And because I'm sort of a bridge person, I grew up here and had some connections to a different generation of progressives and leftists. I saw some of that in the same way that now I see it as we relate maybe to some younger people from Occupy. You mentioned Ruth Gundle. I knew her, I believe it was her aunt and uncle were old communists in Portland. You know, they were delighted at all the young people that were doing activist things. Another thing that came out of the household, the organization that May and I were part of, was a women's printing collective, and they had space in the old IWW hall, and the old-timers there, the men welcomed them in. They welcomed these young women to come have a printing collective in their hall and hoped that it would revive some of that activism, which now is again. But Portland had a long history of activism, and it skipped a generation with the Red Scare. The people that you know, my father knew lawyers that lost their jobs because they were identified as communists. We knew the artist that was related to Rose, who was blackballed after having art work. And one of the few women artists that was involved in the, what was it, CCC art projects, and then was blackballed. So they were people that went underground, like in every city, but they were here in Portland, and it had a very vibrant past. And that was getting passed down. And then also that we went, it was not so ingrown that we didn't have connections. Like in our house, we did support work around Wounded Knee when that happened. We went out to the farm worker picket lines, and we were working with people from the Catholic community, Catholic worker houses, and the UFW organizations. So there was all that cross-pollinization, not to mention us getting a lot of our ideas from the Black Panther parties that were going really strong in Portland. And they were doing breakfast programs and stuff. The AIM movement, like I said, and all these other liberation movements. So it was just very, very exciting to be working in those times, to be trying to put it into practice, often very unsuccessfully. But that part really reminds me of Occupy again.
I'm Frodo. I thought I should say and explain why earlier a lot of the speakers were talking about the bars, because that's not the same phenomenon now. And what was happening then was the only place where women could meet women, really for anything, but especially if you were interested in getting together, were the bars. The only other places were the women's bookstore and mountain moving cafes, women's night, like you said. And so we, who were younger, a little bit younger, had to go out and get fake ID. And then we went to the bars with our fake ID because there was no other way to congregate with women. And later on there began to be organizing around what we could do as young women who were illegally going into the bars, because that was the only place we could meet. So that was going on. The other thing that we haven't said yet was at the same time all these other things were happening, there was the beginnings of the women's spirituality movement, and I know there's others in the room who were there before me in that movement, and that's still going on.
My name's Kristen, and I've been very curious about the war tax resistance movement, and I wondered if anybody could speak to any organizing around that and the history, if you're still doing it, and kind of the future of that, if there is any.
Well, I was the one that mentioned the tax resistors. We did tax resisting for a number of years. And you know, it was, of course, during the Vietnam War era. We probably should be doing it now, but we're not. I don't.
There are some people doing it.
There probably are some people in the room.
Sandy to your left. I'm not. My name is Ann McLaughlin. I'm not personally doing war tax resistance, but I'm sure that the folks through the Metanoia Peace House over on 18th and Tillamook are still involved in that. and there's John Grusho, who works with them, draft counseling project.
Well, I'll say a little something. This is Sandy Polisha, about the tax resistance then. There was some little tax on the telephone bill at that time that was supposed to end, and they extended it to pay for the Vietnam War. So a whole lot of us were refusing to pay our telephone tax. And it wasn't very much. It was probably 20, 30, 40 cents a month. But at one point, the telephone company, I was doing it, and the telephone company told me that I had to, with every bill, send a note saying that that's what I was doing. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to do that, then I'm going to use it as an opportunity, and I would write a little note about the particular, whatever had outraged me in that morning's paper that I would put in with my little note. And then one day I got a phone from the telephone company, and they said, I was married at the time, and they said, we need your husband to be writing that note because the phone is in his name. And I said, well, I pay the bill, so that's your problem. And by the way, I hope I'm not causing you a problem, you know, making the bill. Oh no, I look forward to your bill every month. So that, you know, a little brightness in a boring job. So.
There's someone.
Oh, good. Yeah. We allow men to speak.
My name is George Nicole. I'm a gay historian. I'm a friend of Kristen, and I came to present her with a shirt.
That is fabulous. Would you like me to deliver this to her?
Oh, I'll take it.
You go ahead. Yes, I think you should give your own gift.
Hi, I'm Usawa, and I started with my sister and some friends. The women's land that's in Estacada that's still going to this day. Oh, can you hear?
Yeah.
Which is now Weemoon land, but once upon a time, I think when we first started it, we called it Hidden Hilltop. That was in 1973. And actually, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary as an intentional women's community this fall equinox. So, but that was a different direction. A lot of the activism was going on in the city, and at the time, at that time, it was considered almost sort of counter-revolutionary. What do you mean? You know, it all happens in the city, and we were really. At that point, well, we wanted a women's-only space, which it was a whole new concept back then, and it's almost becoming a new concept again. But we really wanted to work on community and how we live together, and you know that the personal was political, that aspect of the feminist movement, and also just learning how the skills to live on our own as women, to build our buildings, to fix the tractor, to hay the fields, to pay the payments. And also, yes, we were involved in consensus also, and needing to get some training in how to do that. And in a lot of ways, it was actually very helpful. It has been. I mean, we've actually been a community consistently since then. It's changed a whole lot. And right now, it feels like we really need to go in a whole new phase, and who knows what that'll look like. But it was another thing that was happening in the 70s, and I was very involved with a lot of the things. I was also part of starting women's studies at Portland Community College. But anyway, they were all interrelated groups, and we all kind of knew each other through the different work that we were doing. And there was something about that can-do thing that you just had to, you know, we didn't have any foremothers who had done it before us, any of these things that we were doing. We just had to figure out how to do it and do it. And somehow, and you didn't have to be alone to do that anymore. And that was also the collective working collectively was a really important part of it. So, and I am pretty interested about what's carrying forward now, what's still surviving from back then. A lot of those institutions that we started no longer exist. Even the women's consciousness in terms of, there's just ways in which the movement has been quite co-opted in a lot of different directions, and it's hard to tell what's what anymore. So I'm really interested in that, what's happening with the women's movement now.
Kristen, it doesn't look like we have any more comments, and we've got 15 more minutes. Would you like to talk about the music, the women's music scene a little?
Sure. Well, I'd be happy to. I certainly could. One of the reasons that I wasn't here when Bradley Angle was formed was that I had by that time begun to tour with the other women musicians that I was working with. In the I guess about '73, we started a women's choir here. It was predated the lesbian choir by quite a few years, and it was called the Ursa Minor Choir, after Naomi Little Bear, and Ursa Minor being the little bear. And we had it for 2 or 3 years. The first year was, we had 2 men in the choir. One of them was Steve Fulmer, who had just graduated from Portland State and later founded the Gay Men's Chorus. But he was a bass that sang with us the first year, and there was one other guy, whose name I forget, but then the second year we were women only, and we kind of kicked them out, or they decided they would bow out. I don't know how that happened, but we toured around the state and around the Northwest a little bit, and a friend of ours is here from Seattle, Doris, who was a producer of women's music and, well, all kinds of music, folk music, from a tavern up in the U District in Seattle called Century Tavern. And she was involved with choirs up there, and she brought Ursa Minor and Izquierda and Naomi up there to perform in Seattle, and that was wonderful. And eventually, we went to the National Women's Music Festival and to the Michigan Women's Music Festival. Ursa Minor was like a couple of years, and then an ensemble developed out of that called Izquierda, which was Naomi and me, and Izetta Smith, and different people in the 4th position. Robin Chilstrom started out there, Kate Campo started out there, I think, the first time, and then Robin. And then June Adams was there at one point. We had different persons in that 4th position, but we toured nationally for 4 years, made probably the last actual physical album, 33 1/3 album that was ever made, because right after that, CDs came in. So.
Say something about the diatoms.
Around, oh yeah, okay. So anyway, the Izquierda went from 76 to 80, and then we broke up. I don't know why we broke up. I don't know why. It's just, we ran out of steam. We couldn't do it anymore. It was too hard. But right around that time, there was a New Year's Eve party that was put on by Every Woman's Company, which was another kind of a social group that was creating a sort of an idea of a social club of lesbians that LC was involved with, and they had a New Year's Eve party to sort of kick off some things, and a bunch of us got together and did a show called the Dyke Tones, which was old 50s music that we rewrote the lyrics to, and we dressed up in characters, and it was hysterical. And we did it all very tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of people in the audience said, oh, you should go on tour, you should do it. And we're like, oh, come on, it was just poking fun at all the sexist stuff from the 50s, in a sort of way. So, but it was very popular. People liked it, they loved to dance to it, and so it did eventually go on. One of the original members, Sharpriolo, went on and trademarked the name and went all over the country with it and got people from other states to be part of it, and the original people mostly stayed here. But anyway, that was one thing that happened. And women's music, Portland was really a center for much of women's music, and Elsie could talk about this too, because she was a KBOO person back then, and she had a program called Women's Soul that was always playing women's music, and she knew every artist in the whole country and maybe even internationally. It it was always such a pleasure to hear that show, because she would juxtapose things really beautifully that didn't have anything to do with each other, but the music went together so well. So anyway, the National Women's Music Festival and the Michigan Women's Music Festival were places where we performed and were able to meet women from all over the country, and then they would hear you sing there and play there, and then they would invite you to come to their town. So I learned how to be a booker for tours, and I was able to call up places all across the country and plan a tour, and then take whatever group it was on tour around the country. So that was quite a skill to develop just by the seat of your pants, you know, to figure out how to do. But that speaks to the national level of community that existed. You know, the same kinds of feelings of connectedness of projects that we had in this town existed in other towns too. And then once you started touring and moving at that level, you started to feel like everywhere was your community. And I was just as comfortable sleeping in Doris's living room on her couch as I was sleeping in Ann Arbor, Michigan on somebody else's couch, you know. So
you were bringing it around.
Yeah, well, it was a way of communicating. We didn't have cell phones. You kind of forget that we didn't have the internet. We didn't have cell phones. We had traveling up and down the West Coast. There were people hitchhiked and people rode cars, and you know, remember it? Bev and I and Bonnie's sister Mary Beth hitchhiked to Oaxaca, Mexico and back. Wow. The four of us, you know, just on the spur of the moment, we decided we would do that. And, you know, we had a great time. So those things happened.
Moving very easily from music to writing, would you like to talk a little bit about Flight of the Mind?
Sure. Well, I was just thinking, listening to Kristen, that the women's literary world was very much like that, in that there were women's bookstores all over the country at one time. There were over 400. There were women's journals and magazines all over the country, some of which, you know, we read here, like Off Our Backs and Sinister Wisdom and many others. And so there was a national community as well as a Portland community, and eventually I left being a lawyer. I was a lawyer longer than just at the Law Project, but eventually became a feminist publisher and published books and sent my authors around, very much like Kristen described, to these feminist bookstores all over the country. And feminist, God knows anything, you know, they were just so delighted to, you know, in the middle of Iowa, you could get a crowd of 150 women to come hear the new feminist author. And that just doesn't exist anymore. It was a moment in history, convergence of things, but it did, I guess unlike Musawa, I feel like it made possible things that came after it, even though that evaporated. Those, you know, none of those things exist anymore, except maybe Sinister Wisdom is still going, I don't know. But it was, you know, things evolved from it, and things were made possible because of it. And eventually, you know, the big bookstores wanted those authors, and you know, at that time there were very few women writing, and there were very few women writing about women's lives. And now, as you know, that just, it's, I don't think it's, I guess for me, I think it's a good thing that it's been taken up by the mainstream, and everybody has access to this energy, this material, these women. The possibilities are larger now. Although, you know, it's hard not to be nostalgic for that old world, because there was something just very special about it, and empowering to everybody who participated in it. And you know, I guess I hope that does come along again in my lifetime. I don't know if it will, but I'm grateful that I was alive when I was, and the age I was when I was, that I got to be there and be part of it.
This brings to mind the concept that we debated a lot at the time about working within the system or working outside the system. You know, were we going to be co-opted by the system? And so when we say, well now, you know, all the big bookstores have all these, but how does that change us, you know, by participating in the big system? Are we changed by that, as well as us changing them, or were they changing us? You know, that debate, I think, still exists and goes on.
You forgot Flight of the Mind.
Oh, Flight of the Mind. Well, Judith and I, who's sitting right here.
Was it in the 70s, the Flight of the Mind that started?
It started actually in the 80s, in the early 80s.
Yeah.
For 18 years.
Went for 18 years.
That's a fabulous thing.
We ran a writing retreat, writing workshop program for women on the McKinsey River in a very beautiful spot. And it was it was, you know, one of those things, if we had any idea what we were getting into, we probably never would have done it, but we just kind of incrementally fell into it. At the end, we had about, I don't know, it was 180 people there over 2 weeks. We had a whole staff that cooked. We brought all our own food down to this place. Brought teachers in from all over the country, really wonderful writers like Grace Paley and Naomi Shihab Nye and all kinds of amazing women. And it was, in some ways for me, I think it was my last big feminist organizing experience in a way, because it was once again, like the Law Project, organized we ran it according to what we considered to be feminist principles, although they were very different feminist principles than we used at the Law Project. For example, we wouldn't let women who were there to write come in the kitchen and do dishes or help cook. And there were huge arguments about that in the beginning. People just thought that was terrible to have, you know, some women in the kitchen cooking and others just eating and writing. But in fact, the women who were there cooking loved to cook, they were good at cooking, they were paid really well, they actually had a really good time. They came back year after year after year, and we thought that the women writers needed a week just to be taken care of. That was sort of a revolutionary idea, that a woman might need a week where she didn't have to do any of those things. So, you know, that's sort of an example of how, you know, nothing stays the same. You kind of have to always be reinventing and rethinking what's sort of revolutionary at one time is not later. But it was a place where, for some people, very important changes took place, like had taken place early on in the women's movement. And a lot of women who came had not been part of that, and for them this was their first experience, even kind of living in a world of women just for a week, which by itself was uncomfortable for some women. In the early years, this was back at a time when who was lesbian and who wasn't was a big deal, and thank God that isn't anymore. I mean, nobody cares anymore, but it was very important back then, and inevitably some women who were lesbian would think they were the only ones, and some women who were heterosexual would think they were the only ones. And we would always ourselves try to kind of figure it out. It was almost always about half and half. But it was such a sensitive issue that people were very, you know, I don't know, very concerned about it. But in any event, we went through, you know, interesting struggles and had maybe some of the most euphoric moments of my life during those workshop days, and I think that was true for a lot of people. I don't know, Sandy, do you want to say anything? You came many times.
A lot of really important books came out.
Yes, a lot of very important books came out of it. A lot of very important friendships and love relationships came out of it too. I mean, astonishingly amazing numbers of writing groups that stayed together and are together still. Partnerships of various kinds, friendships of various kinds. It was a place where people, so this was the 80s and 90s, when feminism was fading out, and it was then still a place where you could go and some of that same energy was there, some of the same things were possible. You could learn in a way about feminism. although we occasionally had women who got there who had no idea what was, you know, what they just thought it was a writing workshop, and were, you know, thought they'd landed on Mars when they realized where they were and what it was. But mostly it was I don't know, kind of an amazing piece of this Portland women's history.
Well, I think we need to wrap it up because KBOO is going to go off the air, or this program on KBOO is going to go off the air in a couple of minutes. KBOO will not, and they will be on all day tomorrow, I believe, with their international women. Yes, they're shaking their head, yes. Absolutely special programming for women all day tomorrow.
Till 6 a.m. Saturday.
And Saturday.
Till 6 a.m. Saturday.
Till 6 a.m. on Saturdays. So, this is, boy, that's So I'll say good night to those of you at home, and thank you for joining us. And those of you here, we can be in this room until 9 o'clock, so you don't feel like you have to go run off. We can certainly have more discussion, and thank you all for coming. It's been a fabulous audience, a marvelous panel.